Hello and welcome. Today I will be talking about my favorite true crime podcast. Let me just say that this list is not all of the best true crime podcasts out there. These are just my personal favorites. Since we're in quarantine, I thought it'd be fun to share some of my favorite true crime podcasts. If you're into true crime or like podcasts or just have a lot of time on your hands, this is perfect for you. So the first podcast on my list is called Serial, and most of you probably heard about it. It was the first real podcast I ever listened to. My friend recommended it years ago when it had just come out, when they were like still making new episodes. This is kind of the podcast that started the whole true crime podcasting phenomenon that it is today. What's crazy about it is that it's still an ongoing case, even like 4 or 5 years later. So quickly, what it's about is this investigative journalist named Sarah looks into an old murder investigation, basically, where this high schooler named Hae-Min Lee was murdered, and they convicted her ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed. And what's crazy about it is that there's not really any evidence that he did it, but there's also not really any evidence that he didn't do it. And it's just, it's one of those podcasts where you kind of have to form your own opinion. Spoiler alert, Adnan is still in jail for this crime that he may or may not have committed. And what's great about the podcast is Sarah never really concretely says whether she believes he did it or not. She just kind of gives you the facts and says, this is it? Like, what do you think? And it blew up. It became huge, and it's still huge. I think there's a couple more seasons of it now, but from what I've heard, the first season is the best. So my second true crime podcast that's really good. This one's really short. I think it was only like 7 or 8 episodes, but it's called Man in the Window, and it's about Joseph DeAngelo, aka the Golden State Killer, aka East Area Rapist, aka Original Night Stalker. He has a lot of nicknames, but he was the Golden State Killer that was terrorizing like the Bay Area in I think it was like the 70s and 80s maybe, but he was finally caught like 2 years ago, which is wild because he's an old man now. But this podcast is so creepy and good because it's about people that knew him when this was going on, and oh, so good. Anyway, Man in the Window. My next one on my list is called Teacher's Pet. This one is so frustrating because it's a case of clearly the husband did it, like obviously he did it, but has never been convicted. I think actually, wait, no, I might be wrong. I think like last year he actually finally got arrested, but this one's pretty fucked up because it's about a high schooler who fell in love with a student and most likely murdered his wife, and then the student moved in and they got married, and it's just like, whoa. And like, I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, but the podcast is really well done. It's a story out of Australia, which is interesting because a lot of the murder stories I hear about are from the United States because this country is just whack. This is a really good one. It's a series, kind of like Serial, where the whole podcast talks about the one case. And it's pretty long, but it's good. The next one I have on my list is called Up and Vanish. This is another series where the whole podcast talks about one case. And this is about a teacher that went missing. It's been a while since I listened to this one, but I think it was somewhere in the South. And there's like all this weird evidence, but no one was ever convicted of her disappearance. And what's wild about this one is that from the podcast, I think a few people were actually arrested. Don't quote me on that. I listened to this a few years ago, but really good investigation, kind of creepy, but also interesting. This one is heartbreaking because it's a big story out of my hometown. I'm from St. Cloud, Minnesota, and I think it was like 90 something, Jacob Wetterling was kidnapped, and for like 30 years was never solved. And this podcast, In the Dark, is about the police investigation and how badly the police fucked up on this one, and how easily it could have been solved if they had just done better. And it's so frustrating. But another spoiler alert, the best part about this podcast to me is that right when it came out, so they had already recorded everything, right? But right when it came out, it was solved, which is just like, what are the odds? So definitely give a listen to that. Jacob Wetterling is the reason we have helicopter parents now. And since I'm from that area, my parents always were like, remember what happened to Jacob Wetterling, you know, like don't ever go out at night or alone or whatever. And you know, so this one affected my childhood, which is why, for me, it hit hard because Jacob Wetterling was huge in central Minnesota and kind of the whole United States. But In the Dark is about the Jacob Wetterling abduction, and it's really sad. This is more of a funny one. This is called And That's Why We Drink. And it is two friends that talk about, one of them talks about a true crime case, and when she's done, the other friend talks about a spooky, like, ghost story. So you kind of, if you like ghost stories, it's kind of the best of both worlds, and they are really funny. One of them's name is M, and I cannot remember the other girl's name. I'm so sorry. I really like that one. Crime Junkie. A lot of my friends love this podcast, but I have to be honest, I don't really love it, but it's on my list because I love the research that they do and the fact that the cases they cover are really interesting. The only thing I don't like about this podcast is the hosts. Sorry. It's a girl named Ashley Flowers, like that's her real name, and then another girl named Britt, and the way they talk to me is just really annoying. But the podcast itself is really good. So, and the episodes are shorter. They're like 40 minutes, which I like. And then this is another one where every episode is a new case, and that's called Case File. And this podcast is by an anonymous narrator. We don't know who it is, and he's Australian. Let me see if I can just play a chunk of this podcast because the Australian accent is really heavy.
He told interviewing detectives about the strange things that had started happening a month after he and Dahlia married. He mentioned
the episodes are long and it's pretty dry because it's just the narrator talking the whole time, but the cases are always really interesting and he does great research. So I like Case File, especially if you have a lot of time on your hands. Oh, okay. This one is very, very, very funny. It's called Wine and Crime, and it's three best friends from Minnesota, which I love. And one of the reoccurring jokes in the podcast is how their accents are pretty strong, you know, and talk about true crime and you know. I'm from Minnesota, and I feel like I can't even really do a Minnesota accent. Maybe I have one. I can't hear it. This one, every week they talk about a new theme. So one week it might be like crimes committed by children, or like the one I just listened to recently was cyanide crimes, so like crimes related to cyanide. And these three girls are so hilarious. I laugh out loud every single time I listen to this podcast. The episodes are pretty long, but they're worth it and they're funny. Now I'm on to my top 3 favorite true crime podcasts of all time. Number 3 is a podcast called True Crime Obsessed. It is hosted by Patrick Hines and Jillian Pensavalli. They're New Yorkers, and Patrick is flamboyantly gay, which to me could either really annoy you or be hilarious. And to me, it's hilarious. What this podcast is they watch a documentary, a true crime documentary, and then the podcast episode is them discussing the documentary, which I love because a lot of the documentaries they talk about, I don't have access to unless you want to pay for it, and I almost never want to pay for something I'm going to watch once. So like documentaries that they've covered would be like HBO's I Love You Now Die. They did like the Central Park 5, like really big documentaries, and they talk about it and they discuss it and they point out the flaws in the documentary and the flaws in the logic and what they loved about it. And if they do a documentary they hate, they'll talk about why they hated it. And it's so funny, and I love this podcast. So go listen to True Crime Obsessed. Second favorite is called Last Podcast on the Left. They used to be on Apple Podcasts, but now they are exclusively on Spotify, which is fine because it's still free. So if you don't have Spotify Premium, it's okay. You don't need Spotify Premium to listen to the podcast still. This podcast, oh my God, it's so funny. It's 3 comedians, Marcus, Henry, and Ben, and they do incredible research on whatever topic it is they're talking about. And if it's a big topic, they'll maybe do like 2 or 3 episodes on it, so they really cover everything. Henry is one of the funniest people ever in the whole world. Oh my God, I used to listen to this podcast at work all the time and would laugh out loud every single time, and my coworkers like look at me like, what is she listening to? But not only do they do true crime stuff, they do like spooky stuff too. So sometimes they'll do ghost stories, they'll do alien stuff, like the occult. So they do a lot of things, but the true crime stuff they do is hilarious. And there's like, I don't want, like at least 400 episodes. Like they've been doing this show for a long time, and they've covered everything. They've covered like all the heavy hitters: Ted Bundy, Ed Gein, Ed Kemper, Son of Sam, BTK, like any serial killer you can think of, they've covered. And then they do things like the killing of JFK, and they talk about, you know, the Bermuda Triangle, and it's just like so good and interesting and funny and well researched. So great podcast if you love that kind of thing, which I do. My number one favorite murder podcast of all time is called My Favorite Murder, and I will just straight up say that this podcast is not for everyone, but it is for me. My mom hates it. Me and my sister love it. So it is two middle-aged white women named Karen and Georgia, and they talk about, they each cover a case. So every week is different. They cover usually murder. Sometimes it's just a crime in general, and sometimes it's stories of people who survived attempted murder. And what my mom doesn't like about it is they tend to chat a lot, especially in the beginning. They'll chat or whatever for like 30 minutes before they move on to the murder. To me, I like that because I've been listening to this podcast since the very early days. So I've been keeping up with their lives. So I like their life updates, and you know, and Karen is a comedian, so she is hilarious. George is funny too, but Karen is just like, oh, I could listen to her make jokes all day. And then the way they talk about their crimes, they're very careful. They never, I mean, in the past they've had issues, but they've been doing this podcast for years now, and so they are really careful about never victim blaming, and they're very careful with language. Like they'll never say the word prostitute, they say sex worker. Just stuff like that, you know, they're sensitive. They know that crime and comedy are two things that don't always go together, so they try to be sensitive about it, but it still is funny because if a murderer is an idiot, they'll say he's an idiot, and I don't know. If you don't like women chatting, you might not like this one, but I love it. It is so good. That's my list of my favorite true crime podcasts, and those are just my favorite true crime podcasts. I listen to a ton of podcasts. Maybe I'll do another video eventually of just my favorite podcasts in general, but these are my favorite true crime ones. I will try to post them down below, like in the description, so that whoever watches this video, probably nobody, but if anyone watches this video, you can just click the link and it'll take you right to the podcast so you can listen. Maybe I'll just link my favorite episodes and then it'll take you right to my favorite episode. I might do that. But anyway, happy quarantine and get listening.